And this started with me, it started back with what he was saying about Asar Motep when he wasn't accepting his book and didn't even want to read it because it wasn't reviewed by a Chinese Egyptologist. He was just moving the bar, and he could have read the book, and if there were problems with it, he would have seen them firsthand. Because with the SARS books, you don't need to be but a novice in linguistics. So you just take the time to learn a little bit about linguistics, and then you can fact check them. And it's as simple as that. But he didn't want to do that. So he started talking about Chinese Egyptologists. And I'm like, at this point, the dude is just being samboic and silly. Because he wouldn't hold anybody else to that standard. Like, if you really listen to Chief X, he's constantly holding black people to a different standard than he would white. So I'm going to get into it. That was like the first thing. Second, there were others. There were others. I'm hearing others, but to move forward to what's going on now, why this reminds me of Young Pharaoh. Smash Rockwell, also known as Casual, Hieroglyphic True. He was like, hey, since he had heard Chief X say something, and I'm going by what Chief X said recently, but he seems to be all over the place when he says it. He says there were black people in Egypt, but they weren't Egyptians. And then he'll say there were no black people in North Africa. Well, you just said there were black people in Egypt, but they weren't Egyptians. But that Egypt isn't like that's what he says now when he's trying to be clear. So he's always just contradicting himself. He's always misinformation because it's show. It's his character. Some people sambo for the Democrats, some the Republicans. And this dude, for whatever reason, sambos for like Egyptology 7 and Matilda type bigots who pretend to be, I think most of them are black fishing, well, mulatto fishing, pretending to be modern Egyptians, octoroon fishing, I don't know. But I don't think they're really modern Egyptians like that. If you really let them talk, you start to see they just sound like any old white bigot. And I know some of them are edified, so that's how they're going to sound. But from what I've seen, modern Egyptians usually got a little bit more sense. They might be on some of the same stuff, but they usually aren't just going to start to sound like Dixieland racists or even like a Northern racist, like just a typical American bigot. But that's who he sambos for. And when you're samboing for like a lowbrow sect, you aren't really going to bring much to the table as far as educating people on anything, but you can be a giant, pathetic waste and a source of misinformation. And this dude is a blowtorch when it comes to misinformation. I mean, he's a blowtorch and a maelstrom. He's just wild like that. So he's saying that. And Smash, aka Casual, Hieroglyphics Crew, Amin Ra Squad, he gave him a couple of sources. And I'm going to read one of the sources and get to the other. But the first source is words from Diodorus Siculus. He's a Greek who went down to Egypt, hung out, and he was writing about what he saw. He said, but there are also a great many other tribes of Ethiopia, and some of them dwelling in the land lying on both the banks of the Nile and on the islands, the rivers, other inhabiting neighboring countries of Arabia, and still others reside in the interior of Libya. The majority of them, and especially those who dwell along the river, are black in color and have flat noses and woolly hair. As for their spirit, and I want to read this, he didn't include this, but I want to add this to it. As for their spirit, they are entirely savage and display nature of wild beasts. Not so much, however, in their temper, as in their ways of living, for they are squalid all over their bodies. They keep their nails very long like wild beasts, and are far removed from as possible from human kindness to one another. And speaking as they do with a shrill voice, cultivating none of the practices of civilized life as they are found among the rest of mankind, they present a striking contrast when considered in the light of our own customs. So Diodorus Siculus didn't just say they were black. He kind of described them a little bit niggerish. I mean, so if that makes you think, okay, he said the river, that's a long river. He went all the way to Uganda. That's what he saw. Remember, he said Ethiopians. So let me be clear about this. Look at where Ethiopia was during this time. Like, let me be real clear. Because what he also says about the Egyptians specifically, and I don't know if Smash included this, he said they say also that the Egyptians are colonialists sent out by the Ethiopians, Osiris by the, having they, like he says Ethiopians and then Osiris, but not really an end. Ethiopians, Osiris having been the leader of the colony. So my point here is he's seen Egyptians as Ethiopians, and he's describing Ethiopians as such. And X didn't really challenge that. I mean, how are you going to really challenge that? Other source he couldn't really challenge, but it in passing, like when Smash was given the source, he said I think that's the tomb of Seti, and that would end up being the wrong tomb. But Smash was correct with the source he gave, and he gives this image, and it's a facsimile, old Egyptology photo of the tomb of Ramses III, when Egyptians portrayed themselves as like Dinka black. Normally, it's like kind of African brownish red. And I say African because you see this same color. I can show examples. Well, you'll see it outside of Africa. But if you just look up brownish red skin, you see a lot of African Americans. But normally they're like that. But in this image, he's like, well, if you're going to play the true Negro game, this is them saying we are true Negroes. And X really couldn't deal with that. But he decided to play. He decided to play with it. He should have apologized because the first thing he did was say it was Photoshop. And like, if you know Egypt, and this is one of the reasons why I say that a lot of these dudes that he samples for are black fishing or mulatto fishing or whatever, like they aren't real Egyptians, because you know this is not a Photoshop. Like, you ought to be able to look at this and realize the Photoshop didn't exist when this was made. You know, and like kind of a broken clock, X said Afrocentric people made this. In a way, that was true. It wasn't like a primary of the wall, but you can see primaries of the wall. You can see where it says that you got Nehesu right here, and then you got Egyptians right here, and this just red is Remetch. You can see that on the wall. So he just had the tomb wrong, and it was on the fly. But this is stuff that everybody knew, right? That Egyptians put themselves in Ramses III, and they drew him up real dark skinned like the Nehesu. We knew this, right? But Chief X just started coming up with conspiracies. I think, like, first it was the Photoshop, and he kind of walked that back. Then he said that Remetch means people and not Egyptians. And the thing is, you can just look that up. Like, I could look that up on my dictionary that I got on my phone. I could look that up on the dictionary. I keep forgetting the name, like Fosker or something, the one I got on my computer. You could Google that and see that Remetch means Egyptians. So they're calling themselves Egyptians in this picture. You know, so if you're going by the primary, the Egyptians were Afrocentric. That's what I mean by he was right about that, in the sense that you can be Afrocentric. That's who made it. And Wu Zhao explained to him, like he explained in a way that a child should understand. And then X made videos saying that he was scared of him, and they kind of went back and forth. He's like, went to X's channel, and X wouldn't let him on. And then X started saying that Reth is for Egyptians instead of Remetch. And this is where Wu Zhao kind of had to teach. Because I knew what was going on, I just didn't know how it was going on. So I'm going to try to explain this in terms, okay? Kind of explain it simple. In a literal way, Remetch is often spelled out as Reth, or Wretch. And they would leave out the M, because like the M was a tall bird, and I don't think it looked as good in columns. And they probably put it in rows, but when they're writing in columns, they were like, okay, let's pull out, we know this word, because a word doesn't have to literally spell out itself. You have to know enough about it to where you can read it. So a lot of times they would take the M out, but because there were times when they'd keep it in, and they had two M's. They had this other M that was like a flat horizontal thing. I forget, like a half level, I think it's called, or a half side. It's a AS15 glyph. They sometimes would write it like that, and even in my dictionary, it shows that sometimes it's written like that, with the owl, with the AS15, the flat level. So they put it in sometimes, and in Coptic, the word for Egyptian, like the old word, is Rome or Rome. I think it's pronounced more like Rame. So if you follow me, just sometimes they leave it out, and then X was seeing that EA Wallace Budge would leave it out, but then they put sources. So this is why this took hours and hours to really go through this. I'm giving you a quick synopsis because they had to show that almost everyone except Budge, and Budge is old, so there's more like an original thing until they started correcting themselves. Almost everybody writes it as Remetch right now because they know that the M is there and they know it refers to Egyptians, and they'll define it as Egyptians. So they weren't saying these are people, they were saying these are Egyptians. And he didn't apologize. He just stood on that. And like I said, this is something that you could just Google and find out yourself. You can get a phone app and find out yourself. But this is where it got worse, because later on, I was listening to Sonnetter, and Saramotep was on Sonnetter. And this dude called in named Corey. And I was catching the end of it. I missed most of it. And Corey, he reminded me a lot of like a Karen, and just like a niggerish Karen. Like he was just coming off like an asshole. And it just seems like Asar brings out the Sambo in a lot of people. And I don't get it. I don't understand that. To me, I just treat Asar like, like anybody else. Demonstration, as he says, beats conversation. He demonstrates more, so he gets more of my attention. And if I caught him in a mistake, it was 1 out of 50. So I'm like, okay, whatever. Maybe I'm not doing it right. But normally, everything's on the up and up. And I don't test everything. I might test like 5 things an article or something like that. Or 20, like if I'm looking up every word because I'm trying to see if I can find a correspondence in another language that he wasn't using. But I haven't done that in a while. But what Corey was saying was that modern Egyptians are the same as the old, and this is what the experts are saying. He had appealed to authority just down because he didn't even name them. He kept saying the experts are saying that Egyptians weren't black or white. They didn't have a race. The experts are saying this. I'm like, do you always have to bring on a nitwit? And do you always have to have a dude with bells on his feet? But that's how it's been with Sonnetter. Like, he likes to have a fool around and, to hop around and act goofy. So, as an example, they gave him the Cairo Symposium. Cairo Symposium generally concluded that ancient Egyptians were Africans in the sense that we would say black Africans. Then they said that source was too old. But the experts today are saying, not them old experts, we got new information. So I'm like, man, damn, is it Sambo season again? So he went on Pseudo Killer's channel, and I went on that too. Because I'm sick of the lies and the Samboing. So I'm ready to hey, okay, let's hear it out. And from what I've seen, at least a few days ago, they haven't put this show up. So I'm having to remember it, and I got to pull up some notes because I had to remember this because it didn't go up. And man, I was remembering so much information. So I got way too much notes. I'm going to be here all night. All right, I'm going to try to speed this up. Because, the dude was just like I said, between Corey and X, because X also was on this panel, it was just like how he just played the expert's logical fallacy. But let me get to it. This is me kind of remembering what happened when I was on the Pseudo Killers and how, man, and I didn't have a good mic. I still don't. I got a good mic, but my computer just doesn't take uh, um, I have to have a USB connection, and mine is like one of them plugins. At least the computer that I use for this, like when I was on there. So I was on a web camera computer as a mic, and I'm trying to get in some stuff. I'm trying to bring to illuminate this sad contraption. So first thing is Corey and Smash are going at it, and ironically, it went from Smash calling him a no. First, Corey was calling him a Rodney Kimmett nigga because the language of Kimmett is Rodney Kimmett, some pronunciation like that. Rodney Kimmett nigga. I mean, like I said, Corey just came off as niggerish. And Smash didn't really know him, so Smash was like, fuck you. You're a bitch ass nigga. And I thought that was ironic because like I said, my impression was Karen slash niggerish. And Karen is a bitch. So he called him a bitch ass nigga. And I'm like, I'm just, okay, how long are they gonna fight? So then one of the things I remember is it started with Ankh describing Egyptians as indigenous Africans. So I come on and say, and I'm not really, I'm speaking out of turn because it's a lot going on. And I'm saying, yes, they were indigenous Africans, and if they were around today, we'd see them as black people. Then X said they came from North Africa, and I replied, if we're going to clarify North Africans in relation to race, we should say that they were not Atlas Mountain Berbers. They were not double North Africans, because that's where that's where Africa's light skin comes from. And when I said that, that's kind of when 42 was in there, right? That's kind of when I showed up. And then I'm like, you know what? I want to show y'all what the Egyptians said. So I started putting the Egyptians on my computer screen. I'm hitting them with this shit, right? Shablam, shablam. I'm hitting them with this. So while I do that, boom, I get kicked off the panel by Corey. And right before I get kicked off, I hear X saying, they're Nubians. And that another example of him lying. None of these images are of Nubians. I think one is, I don't know. But almost everything you see out of Egypt is an Egyptian. Like if people start showing images of Egyptians, just because most of the stuff that we know is not an Egyptian, like they're a Cushite and a Hesu, like anything that people that can be labeled as Nubians. Most of the people that we know aren't, we know what they are. It's as simple as that. Like we know what they are if they're not Egyptian. And generally when there's an exception, it's mislabeled. It wasn't just that I was sharing my screen. I was also asking the question if like Romans and Greeks were also raceless. And I started asking that again because I called back in, got back on, I'm on the panel again. And X is answering the question. And I don't remember what he was saying, but at first he said that this wasn't about color. And then he kind of meandered around. And then at one point, he starts mentioning skin color. So I butt in and I'm like, dude, I thought you said this wasn't about color. And that threw him off. Like he got befuddled. And then it got kind of chaotic. They started arguing and I'm writing down like the suspect stuff he's saying. And I guess because like, even though that's the only way I interrupted, and then after that I backed out, I'm like, hey man, like you just said, I backed out. I did interrupt and say that, but then I backed out. But then it got chaotic, and then I kind of got blamed for it getting chaotic, and I got booted off again. And at that point, I wasn't going to call back in. And I tried like 5 times, and I about gave up. I think they were talking about Corey's expert in Abu Sir, and somehow I ended up back in. I tried like 5 times, gave up, waited maybe 10, 20 minutes, and then tried again. And they were talking about Abu Sir, and supposedly this is Corey's experts, and this is a contradiction because Abu Sir doesn't make any claims about race. Like everything about Abu Sir they could have not tested an area that's known for Semitic burials. They could have not, they could have tested a whole like 100% Rimich people from the pre-dynastic, even though whatever. And no matter how they line up genetically, it doesn't tell you about who would portray them in a movie. So it's not something, quote unquote, someone who is an expert would say. So Corey was just bullshitting. He was lying. If that is his expert, you presented a logical fallacy in that you can rely on just the expertise of the mysterious. And then there was nothing behind the mystery. It was just, there was nothing, like there's no claim in there. So his quote unquote expert wasn't saying that. So I'm finally about to speak uninterrupted, right? And Chief X says that I'm like the biggest Afrocentric person on the internet, online. And I'm like, yeah, I'll be that. And you're the biggest Sambo, or maybe, I don't know. Unfortunately, you got competition. I said something like that. I was hot, man. I was hot. So when I was talking, I said X, his argument was supposed to not be about color. But when we showed him pictures of black Egyptians, he went nuts and started, acting like all of a sudden Remich doesn't mean Egyptian. Like, I'm going in. And then I shifted and I said, and then in the process, we're learning that an example of Remich meaning Egyptian, there was God, I'd have to look up that video and find out exactly where it's at. But it was an Old Kingdom writing talking about how foreigners in the Delta were as Remich, meaning there was a lot of foreigners to the point where they're like us. So I mentioned that. And I also mentioned that then they're invaded by Assyrians and Persians and Greeks and Romans and Turks and Arabs and British and Arabs again. And then colonized by the British and the French at the same time. And then I was talking about how I was showing images. I was showing these images of the far. And I'm like, okay, well, this ain't looker ship. I mean, these are afros. These are afros. These are not helmets. These are, just going at it. This is like some butter and grease in the hair, and you can't put this on Becky hair. So I'm making those points, right? And then I'm saying, really, it's not just like the hair in these images. You got a cattle culture, totem culture, circumcision, world philosophy, same language. Whether you're talking about half-ass Greenberg or whatever. And again, X was saying they were Nubian. So everybody's a Nubian. When in fact, the word did not exist. So none of these, literally, you can't show somebody a real image of a Nubian. And I remember X saying, this is a kind of another side thing. He said that I got the image from Asar. A lot of people show this image. But I think Asar makes a point, though, that you can't really do this with some lank hair or Becky hair. You can't really do this. So that I got from him. But when he saw this, he said that Asar's picture was photoshopped on Facebook. And I'm like, really? So I bottled that up. And then later on I checked and I'm like, Asar's image is not Photoshop, but you got a bunch of people falsely accusing him of Photoshop. And then when they falsely accuse him of it being Photoshop, they show an image that's a recreation that ain't a primary. And don't read their source that tells you that it's created by a different artist, that it's a recreation of a wall, because they can't carry over the whole wall. And then the image that they use is light, but then they're accusing them of photoshopping it to make it darker. Like, they are doing exactly what they're accusing him of. And I pointed it out, and just like X, they triple down and they don't apologize. This is from Lancelot Crane. So they're wrong about the facsimile, wrong about the original source, because actually this wasn't even the right image. There isn't a recreation for this specific image that I could see. There's others that are like it, and at first I thought this was the right image, but they didn't even have the right image. And that's how, like, this is who he's samboing for. So that's why he's such a blowtorch of misinformation, because they ain't got good sense worth a damn. These, I don't know if they're like the village idiots of Egypt and they're just in that white supremacist shit or whatever. I think most of them are catfishing. Yeah, Sard's image was a little bit darker than the primaries I've seen, but that's probably just when somebody took a picture that wasn't flash, and then that picture gets circulated. Oh, look at this picture, but it's the same image. Like they didn't Photoshop the dang thing to add some color, and really nobody would do that anyway. Like nowadays, you would just use cell phone pictures if you're gonna do something janky like that. But we ain't got to do this. Like I got thousands of pictures of ancient Egyptians. I'm comfortable with this range of diversity. Like, there's no reason for me to, man, I gotta blacken this up. I don't need to blacken this up. This is how they look. I'm okay with this. I will comment on some images that Egyptology faked up with some edits and bias edits or just created something out of the blue. But that's really only like maybe 6, 8 pieces of art where I'm like, no. Most of the stuff I could add more, but most of the stuff they got in the back of the museum because they know. I won't, maybe not most, but maybe this might be like 12, so it could be like half. If you know what I mean. I know I might be out ahead of someone listening to me, but so then Brother Reggie spoke. And again, after Brother Reggie spoke, X is commenting on Brother Reggie. And the thing he said, he's like, about this Green Sahara, what they don't tell you is the people from the Green Sahara went north. They were Berbers. And right away, I'm like, can I get a source for that? Can I get a source? Because I have a source that shows that people from the Green Sahara went southwest. And I put the source there. It's on the front of my channel. Like if you go into my channel, that simulation of the Green Sahara, the source in there says that people in the Green Sahara went southwest. Now, not all of them did. Some of them did go north. Some of them, I think, were stuck in the north at the time. Maybe not literally stuck, but that was just like where they didn't want to go out. They wanted to stick there because they wanted to be by the Mediterranean. So he was just wrong. So I was asking for sources right away. Yeah, I even have the source right here. I put up this text. You can read it. But it literally says that one of the populations that they were tracking shows the depopulation of the Sahara and southwestward movement of the late Holocene populations. And that's where we're related to people in the Nile Valley. Like if you want to know where how African Americans are related to people in the Nile Valley, look at that video and then read that part, and that's all you need to know. Because in the video, you can see like the Green Sahara lasts until really the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And during that time, there's some people going back and forth from like the Central Green Sahara and then to parts of the Nile. I mean, that's why you have Ramses Ewud Biwode. It's that type of stuff. That's why, like, if you look at African Americans compared to like Zulu and compared to like just general North Africa or Ethiopia, even Somali, like more related to Somali than fellow Bantu Zulus. And I think that's probably what it is. It's just there's that much of a disconnect. And that was another thing Corey had an issue with is he didn't like that Assad called an ancient Egyptian sister. Like he was real on that. Like that's frankly where you're just traditional Samboing. How dare you say that about these people? We're not related to them. And I'm like, call. But if you were to call Nelson Mandela brother, who's gonna have a problem with that? And I'm not saying I can say this definitively because you have a different time scale and we don't have much in the way of testing for ancient Egyptians. But the ancient Egyptians that were tested and put that had the Diadae tribe study ran on them, which included Ramses III, they had a pattern like Nilots. It wasn't as strong because they didn't use as many markers, but it was the same pattern. Like they behaved a lot like Nilots. And Nilots are more related to West Africans, I believe, than South. African Bantu. And when I say West African, I'm not really thinking Yoruba. I'm thinking more like West Bantu. Um, I wonder if Balanta is a Bantu language, because Yoruba isn't a Bantu language. Now, I remember there's this one brother, I don't remember his name though, on the panel, and he had told me, like, they're just going to call images lookership, but then he showed a picture of Karaduak, and I was responding, well, are images of Romans and Greeks, is that lookership? Because I always got to point out the double standard. I should have brought up Sumer, because a lot of times people show images of Sumerians, and they'll say, oh, Sumerians weren't black, look at these dudes. I mean, there are other images where you could say, whatever. But are they raceless? Like, where does it all boil down to? Like, is everybody multiracial by today's standards? Like, are we going to true albino and true Negro? What's going on? So then X brought up Skip Gates as a credible, I guess he was calling him an Egyptologist or scholar. Skip Gates is not an Egyptologist. And X, it's not the first time I've heard him. He'll tout Skip Gates. He tries to use Skip Gates as an example of someone who understands what Egypt is and was checking the Afrocentrics back in the day. Excuse me. Said he's known for challenging Afrocentrics and all that. And Reggie got a zinger in, because Reggie said that his degree was in something like African American pose, so that he had a degree in the signifying monkey. So I was cracking up, because I'm like, the dude has a Dolomite degree. But I want to come back to Skip Gates at the end, because there's something I want to show you with Skip Gates. Or maybe I'll just play. No, I'll show you. No, I think I'll play it. One other issue, though, with Abu Sir, and then, because like near the end, right before they were wrapping it up, X was talking about Ramsey's haplogroup. No, he was talking about Tut's haplogroup. And he said that Tut's haplogroup came from Asia. Now, I know his source for this is Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has pages that I think are wrong about haplogroups. I don't really have that much time to really go in, because there's one thing that I'm seeing that really seals it. R1b, K, P, almost all quote-unquote Eurasian haplogroups have to have come from Africa. Because, and I could get in deep on the sources for Wikipedia and why Wikipedia is wrong, and I could get into sources that make somewhat of an argument that I'm making. They'll make it in bits and pieces, but they'll acknowledge the basics, that some of these haplogroups could have came from Africa. There's a lot of sources that say that. And I could get into sources that show where these haplogroups are located in Africa, where K is in Somali, Scorsese et al. I could really get deeper into this on why, say, Tut's haplogroup, because there's sources that show that his haplogroup is the oldest branch in R, the oldest major branch where people have it. And that's what you kind of see across the board. Well, I won't say across the board. You see it with, maybe I could just name them. If you know the branch, you see it with all the mtDNA. And I'll spell it out kind of like I did recently, why it just has to be this way. Because it's not so much that I think, okay, Africa has these in lower frequencies, and then you factor the founder's effect, and you factor the competition that you have, let's just say, with mtDNA, let's just say with L, and you say, okay, you have all this competition. And then you go to Palestine, and there's no competition at all. And then later, there's more diversity in West Asia, Southern Europe. But then as you keep going out, you get to points where there's just nobody. There's nobody in the Americas. There's nobody in the top tips of Europe, like in far northern Europe. There's nobody in Iceland. And once you get to that point, you have what used to be North African haplogroups moving out to the middle of nowhere in northern Europe. Far, I would say, like some haplogroups I think definitely originated outside of Africa. I'm not saying all, but you'll see an early African diversity in some of these Eurasian, mostly European and West Asian haplogroups. So an example is with N, and I'll tell you why this has to be true. N is about 75,000 years old. It gives birth, and it's not terribly uncommon in Africa. It's from what I've seen, it's just rare everywhere. It's an old haplogroup. That's typically what you see because they have to have branches. It's just like a tree. They grow incrementally. So the more people you have, the more people that can have more people. And we're talking women, more available vagina. Have kids, more, have kids, blah, blah, blah. And when you map these out, they look like trees. And the majority, the bigger populations are near the tips. But typically, the more African populations are near the base, closer to. So N's first daughter, oldest daughter, and I am going off the top, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's R. Then you have, I think, JT, then R gives birth to U. And RO, I think, or maybe RO gives birth to U, and then R gives birth to H. I think that's how it is. I'm just going off the top of my head. I'll correct myself in images. But the pattern you see is that the earliest branch of N is the R to HV branch. And it's a big branch. And so much of it, because like H1 is the earliest branch of H, and HV are pretty common in Africa, to the point where if you map out RO, which is also the earliest branch of R, and you map out U6, earliest branch of U, then you have some pretty big populations. Like you have a lot of territory in Africa off of N. Now, you say, well, that could have come from outside of Africa. Here's the problem. This is why this has to be true. This four migration pattern has to be true. If you look at human populations, there's supposed to be this volcano that thinned human population around 75,000 years ago. And that's how you used to hear about it. I think it was like not Tora Bora. I'd have to look it up. But this volcano, from recent studies, we find it didn't affect Africa. There just wasn't a lot of people outside of Africa. Whether this volcano had anything to do with killing off people or whatever, there just wasn't a lot of people. So I'm seeing what used to be like the Earth's population was reduced to 10,000, 5 to 10,000. I think Ankhet might even said that. But no. And now when I'm seeing studies on how big the population was, I'm seeing 600,000, 500,000, 5 to 6. At 75, I checked that, at 65,000 years ago. So if you barely have 10,000 people outside of Africa at 75,000, if that, and in 10,000 years, you're at 500,000 people in Africa, you're only going to be like, I don't know, the population outside Africa isn't going to grow that much from the 6 to 10 that they used to think. So you're looking at 500K to 20K maybe, conservatively. Actually, it would have been more like 550K to 20K. That isn't enough time. Because remember, this population has to do a lot in Eurasia. You have to add to this population. You need more people leaving Africa. And you see that people start to leave Africa around this time. And then you see another increase in people leaving Africa around the time of farming. That's when you start to look at Europe different. It's like, do we want to go up there and deal with all those wild animals while hunting and gathering? That's a bitch to do. But if it's like, okay, let's create some fences and plant some seeds, then it's a different business. You know, it might be tough at first, but boy, you'll be powerful. You have all this land and farmland. That, in theory, is what drove a lot of people beyond where they were. But it's just not enough time, because when you look at HLAs, if you look at language, if you look at bootstrap phylogenetic trees, it's all out, or archaeology, anthropology, it's all out of Africa. There's no big evidence of back migration other than frequency, which you can explain by a lack of competition and the founder's effect, and an initial diversification within Africa before leaving. But if you're going to say this back migrated and was responsible for all of this, you have a problem, because I've seen Eritreans that are RO haplogroup with J. Like, these are haplogroups that are in Africa and West Asia, but mostly in West Asia. But they'll be like African as hell on their ancestry tests once you compare them to a large population of East Africans. So how do they not have this substructure from this bottleneck population that supposedly would have had to come back and be that whole stalk of M, of N and M for some people, while setting up shop outside of Africa? It just doesn't work. There's not enough time, because N is 75,000 years old. It's like it would already have to be, for this to work, it has to be born and nurtured in Africa, because otherwise you'd have to have like a homeland for this somewhere where you have extremely diverse, genetically diverse Eurasians who are capable of fathering and mothering this much of Africa when I show the maps. It's just not possible. And if I'm wrong, how? Tell me how, when you already know that they came out of Africa. You need to hurry up and bring them right back in, because this is early branch diversity. And you see the same with J and T. I mean, I can go into this one by one. You see this with most Eurasian haplogroups, period, where they have like a big brother branch that's the African branch. Or they'll just have a brother branch, like with X. Like one, they're about the same age. Same with Y chromosome J, about the same age, but one is a little more common in Africa, one not. So some lineages look like they did come back when like Arabians were holding an empire, and like were just West Asians in general. Like I definitely think there is some back migration, but it's not to the point where you can explain these lineages, because they're too prominent. Like R1b is the heart of Africa, northern Africa, and a little bit northeast, maybe a tad east, a tad west. It's not terribly, like, it's, in some tribes, it's like 90% from what I've seen. 90%, 20%. Okay, so I want to go back to Skip Gates. I'm going to see if I can find this. I'll play it if I can find it. Okay, I just want you to remember, while you watch this, what Corey was saying about brother and sister, no, about sisters. I'll let Skip Gates say it. Because I always said that X's scholarship doesn't really get past mainstream Egyptology.
Burial pits in the Nile Valley have been the source of rare and unique artifacts dating back more than 6,000 years. They show a rich, creative culture. These prestige items were crafted by artisans to be enjoyed by elites.
How old is this?
So this dates to about 3,600 BC.
Really? This is 6,000 years ago.
Yes.
So the brothers and sisters back in the Nile Valley were combing out their hair with an afro comb.
Yeah. Just like afro combs, these long...
The brothers and sisters back in the Nile Valley were combing out their hair with an afro comb.
Yeah.
Brothers and sisters back in the Nile Valley were combing out their hair with an afro comb. Yeah.
Thick combs would have been perfect for African hair. Mm-hmm. And this is an item that would proclaim status and identity and make a statement. They're often found in the burials, still in the hair, very prominently placed. So these symbols would have been visible.
Just the way black people wear them today.
Absolutely.
Black people were combing their hair with afro combs.
These symbols would have been visible.
Just the way black people wear them today.
Absolutely.
Black people were combing their hair with afro combs. I thought we invented this in the 60s. Amazing.
So the burials at that date were pit burials in the dry sand often that preserves organic materials. We can actually do an archaeology of hairdos and hairstyles.
Oh, what kind of hairstyle?
They've got all sorts. We've got the use of henna and fake hair and big bouffants. There's even a suggestion we've got some mohawks as well.
It's astonishing.
So the people who made this were highly skilled craftspeople. They were making beautiful pottery, very skilled at making stone vessels. All up and down the Nile Valley at this time, we see groups creating very vibrant, personal culture that they would wear and display.
The brothers and sisters back in the Nile Valley were combing out their hair with an afro comb.
Yeah.
The brothers and sisters back in the Nile Valley were combing out their hair with an afro comb.
Yeah.